The rifle cracked through the mountain air, its echo rolling across the valley like thunder. Sarah Parker pressed herself against the rough bark of the pine tree, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the three men advance through the clearing below. They moved with predatory confidence, their voices carrying on the wind as they called out to the cabin hidden among the trees. "We know you're up there, mountain man," one of them shouted, his voice thick with malice. "Come on down and we'll make this quick." Sarah's fingers found the smooth wood of the rifle stock beside her, the weapon Andrew Rogers had pressed into her hands just minutes before. Her palms were slick with sweat despite the autumn chill, and she could taste copper fear on her tongue. 6 months ago, she had been a cast-off wife living in shame in the valley below. Now she crouched in the wilderness, prepared to fight for the only home that had ever truly belonged to her. The sound of splintering wood echoed from the direction of the cabin, followed by Andrew's voice, steady and calm despite the circumstances. "That's far enough, gentlemen. State your business and be on your way." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering how she had arrived at this moment. The memory felt both distant and immediate, like looking through clear mountain water at stones on the riverbed. She had been so broken then, so certain that her life held no purpose beyond the shame that had driven her from everything she had known. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The autumn of 1887 had painted the Colorado Territory in shades of gold and crimson when Sarah Parker first climbed the winding trail that led away from Millfield and into the high country. Her few possessions sat bundled in a worn carpet bag, everything she owned in the world reduced to what she could carry. The divorce papers crinkled in her coat pocket with each step, a constant reminder of her failure as a woman, as a wife. Thomas Parker had made his position clear before the entire town. "A woman who cannot bear children is no wife at all," he had declared from the courthouse steps, his voice carrying across the square where curious onlookers had gathered to witness her humiliation. "I'll not waste another year of my life on barren ground." The words had cut deeper than any physical blow, settling into her bones like winter cold. For 5 years, she had endured his increasingly bitter remarks, his growing resentment, the way his eyes would follow other women in town while sliding past her as if she were invisible. She had prayed, pleaded with God, consulted every remedy the local women whispered about in hushed tones. Nothing had worked. Her body remained stubbornly, shamefully empty. Now, at 32, she found herself climbing into the mountains with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The trail wound upward through stands of aspen and pine, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. Her breath came in visible puffs, and she pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The sound of an axe biting into wood drew her attention as she rounded a bend in the trail. Through the trees, she could see a clearing where a log cabin sat nestled against the mountainside. Smoke rose from its chimney in a straight column, and neat stacks of split wood lined one wall. A garden plot, now brown with autumn, stretched along the cabin's south side. A man emerged from behind the cabin, carrying an armload of freshly split logs. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a beard that spoke of months without a barber's attention. His clothes were rough but clean, practical garments suited to mountain life. When he saw her standing at the edge of the clearing, he stopped, his dark eyes taking in her travel-worn appearance and the bag in her hand. "You're a long way from town, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the careful politeness of a man unaccustomed to unexpected visitors. He set down the wood and wiped his hands on a cloth tucked into his belt. "Trail gets dangerous after dark, especially this time of year." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had not considered how her appearance might strike a stranger, a woman alone on a mountain trail with no clear destination. She began, then stopped. What could she say? That she was fleeing from shame? That she had no home to return to? "I was looking for work," she finished lamely. The man, who she would later learn was Andrew Rogers, studied her for a long moment. His gaze was not unkind, but it was searching, as if he could read the story written in the lines of fatigue around her eyes and the careful way she held herself. "Work's scarce up here," he said finally. "What kind of work were you hoping to find?" "Any kind," Sarah replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. I can cook, clean, tend a garden. I'm not afraid of hard work. Andrew nodded slowly, his eyes moving from her face to the darkening sky above the trees. Storm's coming in, he observed. You're welcome to shelter here tonight. If you've nowhere else to be, there's a spare room and I could use the company for supper. The offer caught her off guard. In town, no decent woman would accept such an invitation from a stranger. But here in the wilderness, different rules seemed to apply. Besides, she could see the truth in his words about the approaching storm. The wind had picked up, sending leaves skittering across the clearing, and the air carried the sharp scent of coming snow. That's very kind, she said. I don't want to impose. No imposition, Andrew replied. Been a while since I had someone to cook for besides myself. Come on in before the weather turns. The cabin's interior was simple but well maintained. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a fire crackling warmly in the hearth. Rough-hewn furniture filled the main room, clearly handmade but crafted with care. Shelves lined the walls, holding books, tools, and various supplies. Everything spoke of a man who lived alone but took pride in his surroundings. You can put your bag in there, Andrew said, gesturing toward a doorway that led to a small bedroom. I'll get supper started. Sarah set her carpet bag on the narrow bed and looked around the room. It was sparse but clean, with a window that looked out over the valley below. Through the glass, she could see the lights of Millfield beginning to twinkle in the growing dusk, looking impossibly distant and small. When she returned to the main room, Andrew was working at the stove, stirring something in a large pot. The smell of venison stew filled the air, rich and warming. He had set 2 places at the wooden table, complete with cloth napkins and real silverware. Smells wonderful, Sarah said, settling into the chair he indicated. Deer I took last week, Andrew replied, ladling the stew into bowls. Vegetables from the garden. Simple fare, but filling. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind beginning to howl outside. Sarah found herself studying her host, noting the careful way he moved, the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard physical work, the intelligence in his dark eyes. There was something peaceful about him, a quality of stillness that she found soothing after the case of her recent life. You're running from something, Andrew said suddenly, his voice gentle but direct. Sarah's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She considered denying it, but something in his manner suggested that dishonesty would be pointless. Yes, she admitted. Want to talk about it? The simple question, asked without judgment or prying curiosity, nearly undid her. She set down her spoon and folded her hands in her lap, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. My husband divorced me, she said quietly, for being barren. He made it very public, very clear that I was defective. Andrew's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. That's a hard thing to bear. The whole town knows, Sarah continued, the words pouring out now that she had started. I couldn't walk down the street without feeling their eyes on me, hearing their whispers. Some pitied me, others thought I deserved it. A few of the married women seemed almost glad, as if my failure somehow made their own lives more secure. So you left. I had to. There was nothing left for me there. She looked up at him, expecting to see the same mixture of pity and discomfort that had become so familiar in recent months. Instead, she found only quiet understanding. Children are a blessing, Andrew said carefully, but they're not the only measure of a person's worth. Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. You speak as if you know something about it. Andrew was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of old pain. I was married once. My wife, Elizabeth, wanted children more than anything in the world. We tried for years, but it never happened. The doctor said it might be her, might be me, might be something else entirely. Did not matter in the end. What happened? She died 3 winters ago. Pneumonia took her quick. He turned back to Sarah, and she could see the grief that still lived behind his eyes. Point is, she was a good woman, whether she bore children or not. Made me a better man just by being in my life. Anyone who can't see past such things isn't worth your worry. The words settled over Sarah like a warm blanket. For the first time in months, she felt some of the tight knot of shame in her chest begin to loosen. Here was a man who understood, who had faced the same disappointment and emerged with his humanity intact. Outside, the storm that Andrew had predicted began in earnest. Snow pelted against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees with increasing fury. Sarah shivered despite the warmth of the fire. "Looks like you'll be staying more than one night," Andrew observed, glancing toward the window. "This storm's got the feel of a big one." "I don't want to be a burden," Sarah said, though the thought of venturing back into the storm filled her with dread. "No burden," Andrew replied firmly. "I meant what I said about enjoying the company. Gets quiet up here, especially in winter." The storm lasted 3 days, dumping nearly 2 feet of snow on the high country and making travel impossible. During those days, Sarah found herself settling into a routine that felt more natural than anything she had experienced in years. She cooked meals while Andrew tended to his animals and maintained the cabin. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes reading from his collection of books, sometimes simply enjoying the comfortable silence. She learned that Andrew had come to the mountains 5 years earlier, after Elizabeth's death. He had been a school teacher in Denver, but grief and a desire for solitude had driven him to seek a different life. He supported himself by trapping in winter, hunting and trading furs, and growing a large garden in the brief mountain summer. It was a hard life, but he seemed to have found peace in its simplicity. On the third morning, Sarah woke to brilliant sunshine streaming through the bedroom window. The storm had passed, leaving the world transformed by a blanket of pristine snow. She dressed quickly and emerged to find Andrew already up, standing on the cabin's front porch and surveying the changed landscape. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said as she joined him. The view was breathtaking. The snow had softened all the harsh edges of the mountain landscape, turning the forest into something from a fairy tale. The air was crystalline clear, so pure it almost hurt to breathe. "I've never seen anything like it," Sarah admitted. "Winter up here is something special," Andrew agreed. "Hard, but special." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun climb higher over the peaks. Finally, Andrew turned to her, his expression serious. "Trail will be passable by afternoon," he said, "if you're set on moving on." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced when leaving Millfield. The thought of returning to her aimless wandering, of facing an uncertain future alone, filled her with dread. "What if I wanted to stay?" she asked quietly. Andrew's dark eyes searched her face. "Stay how? For how long?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I just know that these past 3 days have been the most peaceful I've felt in years. I could earn my keep, help with the cooking and cleaning. I know it's not proper, a woman living alone with a man, but..." "Proper according to who?" Andrew interrupted. "The same people who cast you out for something that wasn't your fault?" Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "You barely know me. I could be anyone. Could bring you nothing but trouble." Andrew was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the snow-covered valley below. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Elizabeth and I, we always talked about what we'd do if we couldn't have children of our own. She had this idea that maybe we could help other children, ones who needed homes. There's an orphanage down in Colorado Springs that's always looking for families to take in children, especially during winter when resources run thin." Sarah's breath caught. "You're thinking of taking in orphans?" "Been thinking about it for a while," Andrew admitted. "This place could support more than just me, and there are children who need homes. But it's not something a man should do alone. Children need a woman's touch, a mother's care." The implication hung in the air between them. Sarah felt her heart begin to race as she considered what he was suggesting. "You're asking me to stay and help you raise other people's children?" "I'm asking if you'd consider it," Andrew said carefully. "Not as charity, but as partners. We both know what it's like to want children and not be able to have them. Maybe we could give that gift to children who need parents." Sarah turned away, her mind reeling. The offer was more than she had dared to hope for, a chance at the family life that had been denied to her, but in a form she had never imagined. What would people say? "What people?" Andrew asked. "The nearest neighbor is 10 miles away, and he's got his own concerns to worry about. The children who'd come here wouldn't care about gossip or propriety. They just need love and stability." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settling over her. She could return to the valley, try to rebuild her life among people who would always see her as defective. Or she could stay here, in this beautiful, harsh place, and try to build something new. It wouldn't be easy, she said finally. No, Andrew agreed, but worthwhile things rarely are. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him. This man who had offered her shelter from the storm and now offered her something far more precious. Purpose. When would we start? Andrew's face broke into the first genuine smile she had seen from him. Spring, I think. Give us time to prepare, to get to know each other better. The orphanage will want to meet us both, make sure we can provide a good home. And until then? Until then, we work together. You help me get through the winter. I teach you what you need to know about mountain life. Come spring, we'll go down to Colorado Springs together and see about bringing some children home. The word home settled around Sarah like a warm embrace. For the first time since her divorce, she felt as if she belonged somewhere, as if her life might have purpose beyond her own survival. Winter in the high country proved to be everything Andrew had promised. Beautiful, harsh, and utterly transforming. Sarah learned to read the signs of approaching weather in the behavior of the animals and the feel of the wind. She mastered the art of cooking on a wood stove, of preserving meat in the cold mountain air, of making soap from ash and fat. Her hands, once soft from a life of relative ease, grew strong and capable. More importantly, she and Andrew learned to work together with an efficiency that surprised them both. They fell into routines that felt as natural as breathing. She would wake first and start the fire while he tended to the animals. They would share breakfast and plan the day's tasks, work side by side through the afternoon, then spend the evenings reading or talking by the fire. The isolation that might have driven some people to madness became a source of strength for Sarah. Away from the judgmental eyes of Millfield, she began to rediscover who she was beneath the layers of shame and failure that had accumulated over the years. She found herself laughing again, something she had not done in months. She discovered a talent for storytelling, spinning tales that made Andrew's eyes crinkle with amusement during the long winter evenings. As the weeks passed, their relationship deepened beyond mere companionship. There was nothing improper about it, but there was an intimacy born of shared purpose and mutual respect. They talked about their plans for the children they hoped to bring home, discussing everything from sleeping arrangements to educational philosophy. Andrew revealed his dream of starting a small school for the mountain children who had no access to formal education. Sarah shared her ideas about creating a garden large enough to feed a growing family. The first sign of spring came in early March, when the snow began to melt in earnest and the sound of running water echoed through the forest. Sarah felt her excitement building as the days grew longer and warmer. Soon, they would make the journey to Colorado Springs. Soon, their quiet life would be transformed by the voices and laughter of children. It was during one of these planning sessions that they received their first visitor since Sarah's arrival. The sound of approaching hoofbeats brought them both to the door, where they saw a man on horseback riding into the clearing. Sarah recognized him immediately, Sheriff William Hayes from Millfield, a man who had been present at her public humiliation months earlier. "Mr. Rogers," the sheriff called out, dismounting from his horse. His eyes found Sarah standing in the doorway, and his expression hardened. "Mrs. Parker, heard you might be up here." "Sheriff," Andrew replied evenly, "what brings you all the way up the mountain?" Hayes's gaze moved between them, taking in the domestic scene, the obvious signs that Sarah had been living there for months. "Got some concerns from folks in town, reports of improper conduct, if you take my meaning." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with familiar shame, but Andrew stepped forward, his posture protective. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Sheriff, but Mrs. Parker has been a guest in my home, nothing more." "Guest for 6 months?" Hayes asked skeptically. "Come now, Rogers, you're both adults. I'm not here to play moral guardian, but there are proper ways to do things, and living in sin isn't one of them." "We're not living in sin," Sarah said, finding her voice. "Mr. Rogers has been nothing but respectful and kind." Hayes snorted. "That may be, but appearances matter. You've got a reputation to think about, such as it is, and Rogers here is a respected man in these parts. This arrangement isn't doing either of you any favors." Andrew's jaw tightened. What exactly are you suggesting, Sheriff? I'm suggesting you either make this arrangement legal or end it, Hayes replied bluntly. Marriage or separation, but this middle ground isn't acceptable. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt her heart sink as she considered the implications. Marriage to Andrew had never been discussed between them. Their partnership was built on shared purpose, not romantic love. But without marriage, their plans for the children would be impossible. No orphanage would place children with an unmarried couple. Give us some time to consider, Andrew said finally. Hayes nodded curtly. Don't take too long. Folks are talking, and talk has a way of reaching official ears. He remounted his horse and rode away without another word. Sarah and Andrew stood in silence for a long moment after the sheriff disappeared down the trail. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I should leave. I've brought you nothing but trouble. No, Andrew said firmly. You've brought me more happiness than I've known in years. Don't let one small-minded man take that away. But he's right about appearances and about the children. No orphanage will work with if we're not married. Andrew turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious. Then we get married. The simple statement caught Sarah off guard. Andrew, you can't just marry me to solve a problem. Marriage should be about love, about partnership, Andrew interrupted, about shared goals and mutual respect, about two people who care for each other and want to build something meaningful together. He paused, his voice growing softer. Sarah, what we have may not be the passionate romance of storybooks, but it's real and it's good. I think we could build a strong marriage on that foundation. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. The offer was generous, more than generous, but she could not bear the thought of trapping him in a loveless marriage. You deserve someone who can love you the way Elizabeth did. Elizabeth is gone, Andrew said gently, and I'm not the same man I was when I loved her. What I feel for you may be different, but it's no less real. You've become essential to my life, Sarah. I can't imagine facing the future without you. The words settled over Sarah's heart like balm on an old wound. Perhaps this was not the romantic love she had once dreamed of, but it was something deeper and more enduring, a partnership built on understanding, respect, and shared purpose. The children, she said finally, will have two parents who care deeply for them and for each other, Andrew finished. Isn't that what matters most? Sarah looked into his eyes and saw the truth there. This good man was offering her not just marriage, but a life of meaning and purpose. Yes, she whispered. Yes, it is. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Millfield, with only the minister and his wife as witnesses. Sarah wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that she had carefully mended and pressed. Andrew had traded furs for a new shirt and had even trimmed his beard for the occasion. The ceremony was brief and practical, but when Andrew slipped a simple gold band onto Sarah's finger, she felt something shift inside her chest. This was not the grand romantic gesture she had once imagined, but it was real and solid and true. After the ceremony, they returned to the mountain cabin that was now officially their shared home. The expansion was nearly complete, with 2 additional bedrooms and an enlarged kitchen ready for the family they hoped to build. That evening, as they sat by the fire planning their trip to the orphanage, Sarah felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before. Are you ready for this? Andrew asked, studying the letter they had received from Mrs. Henderson at the Colorado Springs Children's Home. As ready as anyone can be, Sarah replied. What about you? Andrew smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. I've been ready since the day you agreed to stay. The journey to Colorado Springs took 2 days, winding down through mountain passes still touched with snow and into the rolling plains below. Sarah had not been away from the mountain since her arrival, and she found herself marveling at how the world looked different now that she was no longer running from it. The Colorado Springs Children's Home was a large, imposing brick building surrounded by a high fence. Despite its institutional appearance, Sarah could see signs of care, flower boxes in the windows, a playground with swings, children's artwork displayed on bulletin boards visible through the windows. Mrs. Henderson, the director, was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind but sharp eyes. She greeted them in her office, a cluttered but organized space filled with files and photographs of children who had found homes through her efforts. "Mr. and Mrs. Rogers," she said, gesturing for them to sit, "I was pleased to receive your letter. We always need families willing to take in our older children, especially during the difficult winter months." "We understand that older children can be more challenging to place," Andrew said, "but we feel we have a lot to offer." Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly. "Tell me about your situation. You live quite remotely, I understand." Sarah and Andrew took turns describing their mountain home, their plans for expansion, and their vision of creating a loving family environment for children who had known little stability. Mrs. Henderson listened carefully, occasionally asking questions about practical matters like education and medical care. "The isolation concerns me somewhat," she admitted. "These children have often experienced trauma and loss. They need stability, but they also need connection to the broader community." "We've thought about that," Sarah said. "Andrew was a teacher before, and we plan to start a small school for the mountain children. Our children would have regular contact with others their age. And we're not completely isolated," Andrew added. "We have neighbors within a day's ride, and we make regular trips to town for supplies and social contact." Mrs. Henderson made notes as they spoke, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she set down her pen and looked at them directly. "I'd like you to meet some of our children, but first I need to ask you some difficult questions." For the next hour, Mrs. Henderson probed their motivations, their expectations, and their ability to handle the challenges that came with caring for children who had experienced abandonment and loss. Sarah found herself speaking more openly than she had in years, sharing her own experiences with rejection and her understanding of what it meant to feel unwanted. "These children have been hurt," Mrs. Henderson said finally. "They may test you, push you away, act out in ways that seem inexplicable. Are you prepared for that?" "We know it won't be easy," Sarah replied, "but we also know what it's like to feel cast aside. Maybe that gives us something valuable to offer." Mrs. Henderson smiled for the first time since they had arrived. "I think it does. Would you like to meet some children?" The common room of the orphanage was filled with the controlled chaos of 30 children, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers. Some played games, others read or did lessons. But Sarah noticed how many of them watched the adults with wary, assessing eyes. These were children who had learned not to trust too quickly or hope too deeply. Mrs. Henderson introduced them to several children, but it was a group of 3 siblings that immediately captured Sarah's attention. Ruth Garcia, age 12, stood protectively in front of her younger brothers, Jerry Phillips, age 8, and Matthew Ward, age 6. The children had different last names, Sarah learned, because they had been abandoned at different times and their original family name had been lost in the bureaucratic shuffle. "They've been with us for 2 years, Mrs. Henderson explained quietly. Their parents died in a fire, and they've been moved from home to home since then. Ruth takes care of the younger boys like a little mother. They're inseparable." Sarah watched as Ruth helped Matthew with a difficult puzzle while Jerry read aloud from a picture book. Despite their circumstances, there was something unbroken about them, a core of resilience that reminded Sarah of herself. "They're beautiful children," she murmured. "They are," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "But they come as a set. Ruth won't be separated from her brothers, and frankly, I wouldn't want to separate them. They've lost too much already." Sarah looked at Andrew and saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. 3 children would be a significant challenge, especially starting out, but the idea of separating these siblings was unthinkable. "Could we spend some time with them?" Andrew asked. For the next hour, Sarah and Andrew sat with the children, learning their stories and sharing their own. Ruth was clearly intelligent and responsible beyond her years, but Sarah could see the burden of premature adulthood in the set of her shoulders. Jerry was curious and talkative, full of questions about mountain life and wild animals. Matthew was shy but sweet, staying close to his sister, but stealing curious glances at the adults. "Do you have horses?" Jerry asked, his eyes bright with interest. "2," Andrew replied, "and I could teach you to ride if you'd like." "Ruth says maybe we'll get adopted someday," Matthew said suddenly, his voice small. "But people always want babies, not big kids like us." Sarah felt her heart clench. "Well, we don't want babies," she said firmly. "We want children who are old enough to help with the ranch work. to learn important skills, to be real partners in building our family. Ruth studied Sarah's face intently. Why do you want us? People usually have reasons. The question was so direct, so adult, that Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. This child had learned to be suspicious of kindness, to look for hidden motives. Because we have a lot of love to give, and you need parents who will love you. It seems like we might be good for each other. What if we're bad? Matthew whispered. What if you don't like us after a while? Andrew leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Matthew, families don't work that way. When you become part of our family, that's forever. Even when you make mistakes, even when you're scared or angry or sit tired, you'll still be our children. Ruth's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. You really mean that? We really mean that, Sarah said, reaching out to touch the girl's hand. We know this is scary, and we know you've been disappointed before, but we're not going anywhere. The process of adoption took several weeks, during which Sarah and Andrew made daily visits to the orphanage. They took the children on outings, letting them gradually become comfortable with the idea of a new family. Ruth remained cautious but began to show glimpses of the child beneath her protective shell. Jerry warmed to them quickly, chattering excitedly about their plans for the mountain ranch. Matthew stayed close to his siblings but began to seek out Sarah's attention, crawling into her lap during story time. Finally, on a bright morning in late May, they loaded the wagon with 3 children and their few possessions and began the journey home. Sarah sat in the back with the children while Andrew drove, watching their faces as the familiar mountain landscape came into view. It's so big, Matthew breathed, staring up at the towering peaks. And quiet, Jerry added, used to the constant noise of the orphanage. Ruth said nothing, but Sarah saw her taking in every detail of their new surroundings with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to take anything for granted. When they finally reached the cabin, Sarah felt a surge of pride as she saw it through the children's eyes. Andrew had worked tirelessly to prepare for their arrival, adding finishing touches to the new bedrooms and building furniture sized for smaller occupants. The garden was beginning to flourish, and the whole place had an air of expectant welcome. This is really ours? Ruth asked quietly as they climbed down from the wagon. This is really yours, Andrew confirmed. Come on, let me show you around. The first weeks with the children were a mixture of joy and chaos that left Sarah exhausted but happier than she had ever been. The quiet mountain cabin was transformed by the sound of running feet, laughter, and the occasional argument between siblings. Ruth threw herself into helping with household tasks, clearly trying to prove her worth, while Jerry explored every inch of their new domain with boundless curiosity. Matthew stayed close to Sarah, gradually beginning to trust that this new mother would not disappear like so many others had. Sarah found herself drawing on reserves of patience and energy she had not known she possessed. The children tested boundaries, had nightmares, and occasionally lashed out when their emotions became too overwhelming. But there were also moments of pure magic. Jerry's delight when Andrew taught him to fish in the mountain stream, Ruth's shy smile when Sarah praised her help with cooking, Matthew's sleepy contentment when she tucked him in at night. They're settling in well, Andrew observed one evening as they sat on the porch after the children had gone to bed. Better than I expected, honestly. Sarah nodded, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. Ruth is still holding back, though. She's waiting for the other shoe to drop. Can you blame her? She's been disappointed too many times. No, I don't blame her. I just wish I could convince her that she's safe now, that we're not going anywhere. Andrew reached over and took her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them over the months. She'll come around, give her time. Time was something they had in abundance on the mountain, and Sarah began to see its healing power at work. Slowly, carefully, the children began to let down their guard. Jerry's natural exuberance reasserted itself as he realized he would not be punished for being too loud or too curious. Matthew began to venture further from Sarah's side, exploring the cabin and yard with growing confidence. Ruth remained the most guarded, but even she began to show signs of relaxing. Sarah noticed her humming while she worked, saw her smile more readily at her brother's antics, caught her gazing out at the mountain vista with something approaching contentment. The breakthrough came on a hot afternoon in July. Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for canning, when she heard raised voices from outside. Through the window, she saw Ruth and Jerry in the middle of a heated argument near the chicken coop. "You can't tell me what to do," Jerry was shouting, his face red with anger. "You're not my real mom." The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. Sarah saw the girl's face crumple, all her careful composure dissolving. "Fine," Ruth shouted back, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Take care of yourself then. See if I care." She turned and ran toward the forest, disappearing among the trees before Sarah could react. Jerry stood frozen, clearly shocked by his sister's reaction to words he had thrown out in anger. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and went outside swung. "Jerry, what happened?" The boy's defiance crumbled as he saw the concern in Sarah's eyes. "I didn't mean it," he whispered. "I was just mad because she said I could not climb the big oak tree. I didn't mean to make her cry to hike." "I know you didn't," Sarah said gently, "but Ruth has been taking care of you and Matthew for a long time. She loves you very much, and it hurt her feelings when you said she wasn't your real family." Jerry's eyes filled with tears. "She is my real family. She's the only family I remember." "Then you need to tell her that, but first we need to find her." They searched for over an hour, calling Ruth's name and checking all her favorite spots around the cabin. Finally, Andrew suggested they try the old mine shaft about a mile up the mountain, a place Ruth had discovered during one of her solitary walks. They found her there, sitting on a fallen log with her knees drawn up to her chest, staring out over the valley. Her face was streaked with tears, and she looked smaller and more vulnerable than Sarah had ever seen her. "Ruth," Sarah called softly, "can we talk?" The girl didn't look up, but she didn't run either. Sarah approached slowly and sat down beside her on the log. "Jerry's very sorry about what he said." "He's right, though," Ruth said, her voice thick with tears. "I'm not their real mom. I'm just a kid pretending to be grown up." Sarah's heart ached for this child who had carried such a heavy burden for so long. "Ruth, look at me." Reluctantly, the girl raised her eyes. Sarah saw pain there, but also the fierce love that had kept these siblings together through their darkest times. "You may not be their biological mother, but you are absolutely their real family," Sarah said firmly. "You've protected them, cared for them, loved them when no one else would. That makes you more of a mother than many women who give birth." "But now you're their mother," Ruth whispered. "They don't need me anymore." Sarah felt tears prick at her own eyes as she understood the root of Ruth's fear. "Oh, sweetheart, they will always need you. You're their big sister, and that's a job that never ends. But now you don't have to carry that responsibility all by yourself." Ruth's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. She threw herself into Sarah's arms, sobbing with the abandon of a child who had held back tears for far too long. Sarah held her tightly, rocking her gently as she had done with Matthew during his nightmares. "I was so scared," Ruth sobbed against Sarah's shoulder. "So scared that you would take them away from me, or that you would decide we were too much trouble and send us back." "Never," Sarah said fiercely. "Ruth, you are my daughter now, just as much as the boys are my sons. Nothing will ever change that." They sat there for a long time, holding each other as Ruth released years of pent-up fear and grief. Finally, her sobs subsided into hiccups, and she pulled back to look at Sarah with red-rimmed but hopeful eyes. "Do you really mean it? About being your daughter?" "I have never meant anything more in my life," Sarah replied. "You are brave and strong and loving, and I am proud to call you my daughter." Ruth's face lit up with a smile that transformed her from a burdened child into the 12-year-old girl she truly was. "I love you, Mom," she whispered. The word hit Sarah like a lightning bolt. Mom. This child, who had every reason to be suspicious of adults, was calling her mom. "I love you too, Ruth, more than you can imagine." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, where they found Andrew, Jerry, and Matthew waiting anxiously on the porch. Jerry ran to his sister as soon as he saw her, throwing his arms around her waist. "I'm sorry, Ruth. I didn't mean it. You are my real family. You're the best family." Ruth hugged him back, and Sarah saw the last of her walls come down. "It's okay, Jerry. We're all family now. All of us together." That evening, as Sarah tucked the children into their beds, she reflected on how much their lives had changed. A year ago, she had been a cast-off wife with no purpose and no hope. Now she was a mother to 3 beautiful children, a partner to a good man, and a vital part of a growing family. "Mom?" Matthew's sleepy voice called from his bed. "Yes, sweetheart? Are you and Papa Andrew going to have babies of your own?" The question caught Sarah off guard, touching on the old wound that had brought her to the mountain in the first place. But to her surprise, she felt no pain, only peace. "I don't think so, Matthew," she said gently. "But that's okay, because we have you and Ruth and Jerry. You're our children, and that's all we need." Matthew nodded sleepily. "Good. I like being your only babies." Sarah smiled and kissed his forehead. "You'll always be my babies, even when you're all grown up." As autumn deepened into winter, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them all together. The woman who had climbed into these mountains a year ago, broken and ashamed, seemed like a stranger now. In her place was someone stronger, more confident, filled with purpose and joy. But their peaceful existence was not to remain undisturbed. In late November, as the first heavy snows began to fall, they received an unexpected visitor. Sarah was teaching Ruth to embroider by the fire when they heard the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Andrew, who had been reading with the boys, immediately grew alert. "Stay inside," he told them, reaching for the rifle he kept by the door. "Let me see who it is." Through the window, Sarah saw 3 men on horseback emerging from the forest. They were rough-looking, with the hard faces and predatory eyes of men who lived outside the law. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the type, if not the individuals, men who preyed on isolated families and took what they wanted by force. "Andrew Rogers," the leader called out, his voice carrying clearly through the cold air. "We need to have a talk." Andrew stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "State your business and move on. This is private property." The man laughed, a harsh sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Private property," he says. "That's rich, coming from a man who's been squatting on land that doesn't belong to him." Sarah's heart sank as she understood what was happening. These men were claim jumpers, the kind who use forged documents and intimidation to steal land from legitimate homesteaders. She had heard stories of such men in town, but had never imagined they would venture into the high country. "I have clear title to this land," Andrew said firmly, "filed proper and legal with the territorial government." "See, that's where you're wrong," the leader replied, pulling a document from his coat. "Got papers right here that say this land belongs to the Mountain Development Company. You're trespassing, and we're here to evict you." Sarah knew the papers were forgeries, but she also knew that in the remote mountains, legal niceties mattered less than who had the most guns. She gathered the children close to her, trying to keep the fear from her voice as she whispered instructions. "Ruth, take the boys to your bedroom and stay there. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "But Mom," Ruth whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Do as I say," Sarah said firmly. "Now." The children disappeared into the back of the cabin just as the confrontation outside escalated. Sarah heard Andrew's voice, still calm but with an edge of steel. "Those papers aren't worth the ink they're written with." "This land has been in my name for 5 years. "Maybe so," the leader replied, "but possession is 9/10 of the law, as they say, and we're taking possession." Sarah heard the sound of boots on the porch steps and knew the men were advancing. Her mind raced as she considered their options. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and even if they could get word out, help would not arrive in time. They were on their own. Moving quietly, she retrieved the second rifle from its place above the fireplace. Andrew had taught her to shoot during the long winter months, and while she was no expert, she could hit what she aimed at. She positioned herself where she could see the front door, while still being able to watch the children's bedroom. The door burst open without warning, and 2 of the men pushed inside while their leader remained on the porch with Andrew. Sarah raised the rifle, her heart hammering, but her hands steady. "That's far enough," she said, her voice carrying more authority than she felt. The 2 intruders stopped, surprised to find themselves facing an armed woman. One of them, a thin man with cruel eyes, laughed mockingly. "Well, well, the little wife wants to play soldier." "I'm not playing," Sarah replied evenly. "Turn around and walk out that door or I'll shoot." "You won't shoot," the man said, taking another step forward. Women don't have the stomach for killing. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. You're about to find out how wrong you are. Something in her voice must have convinced him because he stopped advancing. But his companion, a burly man with a scarred face, was already moving toward the children's bedroom. Check the back rooms, Jake, he called. See what else they got worth taking. No! Sarah swung the rifle toward the man heading for her children. Stay away from them. In that moment of distraction, the thin man lunged forward, trying to grab the rifle from her hands. Sarah pulled the trigger without thinking, the shot echoing through the cabin like thunder. The man screamed and fell backward, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. The sound of the gunshot brought chaos. Andrew's voice rose from outside, shouting warnings, and Sarah heard the sound of scuffling on the porch. The wounded man's companion had drawn his own gun and was pointing it at her with murderous intent. You shot Billy, he snarled. Now you're gonna pay for that. Sarah worked the rifle's action, chambering another round, but she knew she would not be fast enough. The man's finger was already tightening on the trigger when the children's bedroom door burst open. Ruth emerged like a fury, swinging Andrew's heavy splitting maul with all her strength. The weapon caught the gunman in the back of the knees, sending him crashing to the floor. His shot went wild, splintering the wooden wall above Sarah's head. Stay down, Ruth shouted, raising the maul again. Despite her fear, there was fierce determination in the girl's voice. This was her family, her home, and she would defend it with her life. The wounded man was trying to crawl toward his fallen gun, but Sarah kept her rifle trained on him and, don't even think about it, she warned. Outside, the sounds of struggle had ceased. Sarah heard Andrew's voice, calm but deadly serious. Your friends are done fighting. I suggest you join them in surrendering. The leader's voice came back, thick with rage and pain. This isn't over, Rogers. You can't watch your back forever. Maybe not, Andrew replied, but I can make sure you never get the chance to come back. There was a long moment of silence, then the sound of horses moving away at a rapid pace. Sarah kept her rifle trained on the wounded intruder until Andrew appeared in the doorway, his own weapon ready. It's over, he said, taking in the scene with quick, assessing eyes. They're gone. Sarah's legs suddenly felt weak, and she sank into a chair, the rifle trembling in her hands. The reality of what had just happened hit her like a physical blow. She had shot a man she had been prepared to kill to protect her children. Mom? Matthew's small voice came from the bedroom doorway where all three children stood huddled together. Are you okay? Sarah set down the rifle and opened her arms. The children ran to her and she held them close, breathing in their familiar scent and feeling their solid warmth against her. They were safe. Her family was safe. I'm fine, she whispered into Ruth's hair. We're all fine. The wounded man was loaded onto his horse and sent on his way with a warning never to return. Andrew watched him disappear down the trail, then turned back to his family, who had gathered on the porch despite the cold. Are they really gone? Jerry asked, his young voice uncertain. For now, Andrew replied honestly, but they may come back, and they may bring more men with them. Sarah felt a familiar knot of fear in her stomach. What do we do? Andrew was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the children to the cabin they had worked so hard to make into a home. We fight, he said finally. This is our land, our home. We have legal title, and we have right on our side. But if this Cooper has judges and politicians in his pocket, Ruth said, her voice steady despite her fear, how can we win? Andrew smiled grimly, because we have something he doesn't. We have the truth, and we have each other. And sometimes that's enough. Over the following days, Andrew made several trips to town, consulting with lawyers and filing formal complaints with the territorial authorities. He also spoke with neighbors, warning them about the threat and building a network of mutual support among the mountain families. Sarah threw herself into preparing for whatever might come next. She inventoried their supplies, checked their weapons, and made sure the children knew what to do in case of another attack. But more importantly, she worked to maintain the sense of normalcy and security that the children needed. The legal challenges began almost immediately. Papers were served claiming that Andrew's original land grant was invalid due to a surveying error. Other documents alleged that he had not met the residency requirements for homesteading. Each challenge was clearly frivolous. But defending against them required time and money that Andrew could ill afford. "They're trying to bleed us dry," he explained to Sarah after returning from another expensive trip to the county seat. "Force us to abandon the land because we can't afford to keep fighting." "How long can we hold out?" Andrew's expression was grim. "Not long if this keeps up. I've spent most of our savings on legal fees already." Sarah felt the old familiar fear creeping back, the same helplessness she had experienced during her divorce. But this time was different. This time she was not facing the battle alone. "What if we went public with this?" she suggested. "Newspapers love stories about big corporations trying to steal from honest families." Andrew's eyes lit up. "That's not a bad idea. Cooper's political connections won't help him if there's too much public attention on what he's doing." They spent the next week crafting their story, documenting the harassment and legal challenges they had faced. Sarah proved to have a talent for writing, creating a narrative that was both compelling and factually accurate. When they were finished, they had a story that painted a clear picture of corporate greed versus family values. The Denver Post picked up the story first, running it under the headline, "Mountain Family Fights Corporate Land Grab." Other newspapers followed, and soon their situation was being discussed across the territory. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive, with letters pouring in from readers who had faced similar challenges. But the publicity also brought unwanted attention. One morning in early December, Sarah looked out the window to see a group of men approaching the cabin. Unlike the rough claim jumpers who had visited before, these men wore expensive suits and rode in a fancy carriage. "Andrew," she called, her voice tight with tension. He joined her at the window, taking in the approaching delegation. "Looks like Cooper decided to come himself." The man who emerged from the carriage was indeed Edward Cooper, a well-dressed gentleman in his 50s with the soft appearance of someone who had never done physical labor. He was accompanied by 2 bodyguards and a man Sarah recognized as a lawyer from town. "Mr. Rogers," Cooper called out, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. "I believe we need to have a conversation." Andrew stepped onto the porch, his rifle within easy reach but not openly displayed. "Mr. Cooper, I've heard a lot about you lately." Cooper smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes. "I'm sure you have, just as I've heard about you. Quite the media sensation you've become." "Just trying to protect my family and my property?" "Yes, about that," Cooper said, pulling out a leather portfolio. "I have a proposition for you, a generous offer to purchase your land, well above market value. Enough to set you and your family up comfortably anywhere you choose to go." Sarah joined Andrew on the porch, the children clustering behind her in the doorway. She could see the calculation in Cooper's eyes as he took in their family, looking for weaknesses he could exploit. "This land isn't for sale," Andrew said firmly. Cooper's smile widened. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Rogers. It's just a matter of finding the right price." He named a figure that made Sarah's breath catch. It was more money than they could earn in 10 years of mountain farming. "That's a lot of money," Andrew admitted, "but this is our home. Our children are happy here. We're not interested in selling." Cooper's expression hardened slightly. "I had hoped we could resolve this amicably, but I should warn you, Mr. Rogers, that I have significant resources at my disposal. Legal challenges, political pressure, economic warfare. I can make your life very difficult." "You already have," Sarah said, stepping forward, "but we're still here." Cooper turned his attention to her, his gaze appraising and dismissive. "Ms. Rogers, surely you can see the wisdom of accepting a generous offer rather than subjecting your family to a prolonged and ultimately futile struggle." "What I can see," Sarah replied evenly, "is a man who thinks he can buy anything he wants, including other people's homes and happiness. But some things aren't for sale, Mr. Cooper." The businessman's mask slipped slightly, revealing the ruthless ambition beneath. "Mrs. Rogers, you seem to be under the impression that you have choices in this matter. Let me be clear. I will have this land one way or another. The only question is whether your family suffers in the process." Andrew stepped forward, his posture protective. "Are you threatening my family, Cooper?" "I'm simply stating facts," Cooper replied smoothly. "Accidents happen in the mountains. Families disappear. It would be tragic, but these things occur. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Sarah felt the children press closer behind her, and she reached back to touch Ruth's hand reassuringly. "I think you should leave now," Andrew said, his voice deadly quiet. Cooper nodded, apparently satisfied that his message had been delivered. "I'll give you 1 week to reconsider my offer, Mr. Rogers. After that, I'm afraid things may become rather unpleasant." He climbed back into his carriage, and the delegation departed as smoothly as it had arrived. Sarah watched until they disappeared around the bend, then turned to find her family staring at her with frightened eyes. "What are we going to do?" Ruth asked, her voice small. Sarah looked at Andrew, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. They had built something precious here, something worth fighting for. They would not give it up without a battle. "We're going to stand our ground," Sarah said firmly. "This is our home, and no one is going to take it from us." The week that followed Cooper's visit was filled with tense preparation. Andrew made contact with other mountain families who had faced similar pressures, building a network of mutual support and shared information. Several neighbors offered to help defend the Rogers homestead if violence erupted, creating an informal militia of mountain men who valued independence above all else. Sarah worked to prepare the cabin for a possible siege, stockpiling food and medical supplies while maintaining the children's education and daily routines. She refused to let fear dominate their lives, insisting that they continue with normal activities even as they prepared for the worst. On the 6th day after Cooper's ultimatum, their preparations were put to the test. Sarah was hanging laundry behind the cabin when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed. She quickly gathered the wet clothes and ran toward the house, calling out a warning. "Andrew, company coming!" He emerged from the barn where he had been tending to the animals, rifle in hand. The children appeared in the cabin doorway, their faces tense but determined. They had practiced this scenario multiple times over the past week. But the riders who emerged from the forest were not Cooper's men. Instead, Sarah saw Sheriff Hayes leading a group of armed deputies, their faces grim with official purpose. "Mr. Rogers," the sheriff called out as he dismounted, "I have a warrant for your arrest." Andrew's grip tightened on his rifle, but he made no aggressive moves. "On what charges?" Hayes pulled out a folded document. "Assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder, and destruction of private property. Seems you shot up some men who were conducting legitimate business on behalf of the Mountain Development Company." Sarah felt her heart sink. Cooper was using the legal system to remove Andrew from the equation, leaving her and the children defenseless. "Those men were claim jumpers and thieves," she protested. "They attacked us in our own home." "That's not how their sworn statements read," Hayes replied. "According to their testimony, they were peacefully serving eviction papers when Mr. Rogers opened fire without provocation." "That's a lie," Ruth then said hotly, stepping forward despite Sarah's restraining hand. "They broke into our house and threatened us." Hayes's expression softened slightly as he looked at the children. "I'm sorry, kids, but I have to follow the law. Your father will have his day in court." "He's not our father," Jerry said proudly. "He's our papa, and he's the best man in the world." The simple declaration hit Sarah like a physical blow. These children, who had known so much loss and abandonment, had found in Andrew the father they had always needed. The thought of them losing him was unbearable. Andrew handed his rifle to Sarah and stepped forward with his hands visible. "It's all right," he said quietly. "We knew this might happen." "No!" Matthew broke free from Ruth's restraining hand and ran to Andrew, wrapping his small arms around the man's waist. "Don't let them take Papa." Andrew knelt down and gathered the boy into his arms, his voice gentle but firm. "Listen to me, Matthew. Sometimes grown-ups have to go away for a while to take care of important business. But I will come back, I promise." "What if you don't?" the boy sobbed. "Then you take care of your mama and your sister and brother," Andrew replied. "You're a strong boy, and they're going to need you." Sarah watched through tears as Andrew said goodbye to each of the children, giving them instructions and reassurances that sounded far too much like final farewells. When he finally stood and faced her, she saw her own fears reflected in his eyes. "Take care of them," he said simply. "Take care of yourself," she replied. "We'll be waiting for you." The sheriff allowed Andrew to gather a few personal items, then led him away in shackles. Sarah and the children stood on the porch, watching until the group disappeared down the mountain trail. The silence that followed felt oppressive, filled with unspoken fears and desperate hope. "What do we do now?" Ruth asked, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. Sarah looked at her children, these precious souls who had already endured so much loss, and felt something harden in her chest. She would not let them be hurt again. She would not let Cooper win. "Now we fight," she said firmly. "We fight with everything we have." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Sarah made the dangerous journey to town, leaving the children with a trusted neighbor to consult with Andrew's dog, Emil's lawyer, and visit him in jail. The charges against him were serious, and Cooper's influence had ensured that bail was set impossibly high. "The trial is set for next month," the lawyer explained. "But I have to warn you, Mrs. Rogers, the deck is stacked against us. Cooper has witnesses who will swear that Andrew fired first, and the judge is known to be friendly to business interests." Sarah felt despair creeping in, but she pushed it aside. "What about our witnesses? The children saw everything." Children's testimony carries less weight, especially against adult witnesses with no apparent motive to lie. Sarah left the meeting feeling more determined than ever. If the legal system was corrupted, she would have to find another way to fight. She spent the rest of her time in town gathering information, talking to people who had dealings with Cooper, looking for any weakness she could exploit. It was during one of these conversations that she learned about Cooper's greatest vulnerability, his reputation. The businessman had built his empire on a carefully cultivated image of respectability and civic virtue. Public scandal was the one thing he could not afford, especially with several major business deals pending. That required the trust of Eastern investors. Sarah returned to the mountain with a plan forming in her mind. If she could not defeat Cooper in court, perhaps she could defeat him in the court of public opinion. But she would need help, and she would need evidence. Over the following weeks, she reached out to every contact she could think of. Newspaper reporters who had covered their story, other families who had been victimized by Cooper's schemes, even some of the businessman's own employees who had grown disgusted with his methods. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of a pattern of corruption and intimidation that stretched back years. Cooper had used similar tactics against dozens of families, always careful to stay within the letter of the law while violating its spirit completely. But gathering evidence was only part of the battle. Sarah also had to keep her family safe and maintain their claim to the land. With Andrew gone, she was vulnerable to another direct attack, and she knew Cooper would not hesitate to exploit her apparent weakness. It was Ruth who came up with the solution. "What if we're not alone?" the girl asked one evening as they sat planning their defense. "What if it looks like we have more people here than we really do?" Sarah looked at her daughter with new respect. "What do you mean?" "Well, we could set up extra bedrolls, cook more food than we need, make it look like we have a bunch of men staying here to protect us." Jerry's eyes lit up with understanding. "And we could have them take turns standing watch, so anyone watching would see different people at different times." "But we don't have extra people," Matthew pointed out. Ruth grinned. "We don't need real people. We just need it to look like we do." The deception worked better than Sarah had dared to hope. Using old clothes stuffed with straw, strategic lighting, and carefully timed movements, they created the illusion of a well-defended homestead. Ruth proved to have a talent for stagecraft, positioning their dummy sentries where they would be visible to observers while remaining obviously fake only to those who got close enough to be shot. More importantly, word of their apparent reinforcements spread through the mountain community, bringing real volunteers who wanted to help defend the Rogers family. Within a week, Sarah found herself coordinating an actual network of protectors, men and women who took turns maintaining a watch on the cabin and surrounding area. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Cooper's former employees, a bookkeeper named Alan Kim, who had been fired for questioning dubious accounting practices, approached Sarah with information that could change everything. "I kept copies," he explained during a clandestine meeting in town. "Every forged document, every bribed official, every illegal transaction. Cooper thought he had destroyed all the evidence when he fired me, but I was smarter than that." Sarah's heart raced as she examined the documents Kim had brought. Here was proof of everything they had suspected and more. a systematic campaign of fraud and intimidation that had made Cooper wealthy at the expense of honest families. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You could be in real danger if Cooper finds out." Kim's expression was grim. "Because I have children too, Mrs. Rogers, and I want them to grow up in a world where men like Cooper can't just take whatever they want." The evidence was damning, but Sarah knew it would be useless unless she could get it to the right people. Cooper's influence extended deep into the local legal system, but there were still honest officials at the territorial and federal levels who could not be bought. Working with a network of reporters and activists she had cultivated, Sarah orchestrated a carefully timed release of information that would maximize its impact. The story broke simultaneously in newspapers across the territory, accompanied by photographic copies of the most damning documents. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Federal marshals were dispatched to investigate Cooper's business practices. Honest judges called for reviews of cases that had been decided in his favor, and investors began withdrawing support from his various enterprises. But Cooper was not finished. Cornered and desperate, he made one final reckless attempt to salvage his position. If he could not have the Rogers land through legal means, he would take it by force and worry about the consequences later. The attack came at dawn on a cold morning in late December. Sarah was awakened by the sound of breaking glass and the acrid smell of smoke. She rolled out of bed and grabbed the rifle she now kept beside her, calling out to wake the children. "Fire!" she shouted. "Everyone out!" The cabin was filling with smoke, and she could see flames beginning to lick at the wooden walls. Cooper's men had surrounded the building and set it ablaze, intending to drive them out into the open where they could be easily captured or killed. Ruth appeared in the hallway helping Matthew while Jerry gathered their emergency supplies. They had practiced this scenario, but the reality was far more terrifying than any drill. "The back window," Sarah directed, leading them toward their planned escape route. "Stay low and stay together." They crawled through the smoke-filled cabin, the heat growing more intense with each passing second. Sarah could hear voices outside, men positioning themselves to catch anyone who tried to flee. But she had one advantage they did not expect. She knew these mountains better than they did. The back window opened onto a steep slope that led down to a narrow ravine. It was treacherous terrain, especially in the dark, but it offered their only chance of escape. Sarah helped the children through the window one by one, then followed them into the cold mountain air. Behind them, the cabin that had been their home was being consumed by flames. Sarah felt a moment of devastating loss, but she pushed the emotion aside. The building could be replaced, her children could not. "This way," she whispered, leading them down the slope toward the ravine. "Stay quiet and follow exactly in my footsteps." They made their way through the darkness, guided by Sarah's intimate knowledge of the terrain and the faint starlight filtering through the forest canopy. Behind them, she could hear Cooper's men shouting as they realized their quarry had escaped. The ravine offered temporary shelter, but Sarah knew they could not stay there long. They needed to reach help, and they needed to do it before Cooper's men organized a proper search. "Where are we going, Mom?" Matthew whispered, his small hand clutching hers. "To the Hendersons' place," Sarah replied, naming their nearest neighbors. "It's about 3 miles through the forest, but we can make it." The journey was harrowing. They had to move carefully to avoid making noise that would betray their position, but they also had to maintain enough speed to stay ahead of their pursuers. Sarah carried Matthew when he grew tired, while Ruth and Jerry took turns helping each other over the rough terrain. As they climbed toward the Henderson homestead, Sarah could see the glow of their burning cabin reflected off the low clouds. Everything they had built together was being destroyed, but they were alive and together. That was what mattered most. They reached the Henderson cabin just as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Tom Henderson, a grizzled mountain man who had been one of Andrew's strongest supporters, met them at the door with a rifle in his hands. "Sarah, thank God you're safe. We saw the fire and figured Cooper had made his move." "He did," Sarah confirmed, sinking into a chair as exhaustion finally caught up with her. "The cabin's gone, but we got out." Henderson's wife, Deborah Morgan, immediately took charge of the children, wrapping them in blankets and preparing hot food. "You're safe now," she assured them. "Tom sent word down the mountain as soon as we saw the fire. Help is coming." Indeed, within hours, the Henderson homestead was filled with neighbors who had come to offer assistance. The mountain community had rallied around the Rogers family, providing everything from clothes to temporary shelter to armed protection. But the most important arrival came that afternoon when Sheriff Hayes rode up with a federal marshal and a man Sarah recognized as the territorial attorney general. Behind them rode Andrew, no longer in shackles but free and determined. "Sarah!" He dismounted and ran to her, gathering her into his arms with desperate relief. "When I heard about the fire, I thought, 'We're all right,'" she assured him, breathing in his familiar scent and feeling truly safe for the first time in days. "The children are safe." Andrew held her for a long moment, then turned to greet the children who had rushed to embrace him. Sarah watched through tears as her family was reunited, the bonds between them stronger than ever after their ordeal. The federal marshal, a stern man named Edward Cooper, stepped forward with official documents. "Mrs. Rogers, I have warrants for the arrest of several men in connection with arson, attempted murder, and conspiracy charges. Your evidence has been invaluable in building our case." Sarah nodded, feeling a grim satisfaction. "What about Cooper himself?" "Edward Cooper is currently in federal custody," the marshal replied. "The evidence you provided has led to charges that will likely result in significant prison time. His business empire is collapsing, and his political connections can't save him now." Andrew's arm tightened around Sarah's shoulders. "It's over?" "It's over," the marshal confirmed. "Your land title is secure and you have the full protection of federal law. No one will bother you again." The rebuilding began immediately. The mountain community came together in a way that reminded Sarah of old-fashioned barn raisings, with neighbors contributing labor, materials, and expertise to construct a new home for the Rogers family. The new cabin was larger than the old one, with better defenses and more comfortable accommodations for their growing household. But more than just a building was being constructed. The events of the past months had forged bonds between the mountain families that would last for generations. They had stood together against a common threat and emerged victorious, proving that ordinary people could still triumph over corruption and greed when they refused to be intimidated. Andrew's legal troubles were quickly resolved once the federal investigation revealed the extent of Cooper's fraudulent schemes. All charges against him were dropped, and he received an official apology from the territorial government. More importantly, he was offered a position as a federal land agent, helping to protect other families from the kind of predatory practices they had faced. "It would mean travel," he explained to Sarah as they discussed the offer. "I'd be away from home sometimes, investigating claims and helping families defend their rights." Sarah considered the proposal carefully. "It sounds like important work, and we've proven we can handle ourselves when you're not here. Are you sure after everything we've been through?" Sarah looked around at their new home where the children were playing peacefully by the fire and felt a deep sense of contentment. "I'm sure we're stronger than we were before, all of us, and this work could help prevent other families from going through what we did." Andrew accepted the position, and over the following months, he traveled throughout the territory, investigating land fraud and helping honest settlers defend their claims. His reputation as an incorruptible man who could not be bought or intimidated made him invaluable to the federal government's efforts to clean up the territorial land office. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself becoming a leader in the mountain community. Her experience fighting Cooper had taught her valuable lessons about organization and publicity, and she used these skills to help establish a school district that would serve all the mountain children. She also started a newspaper, The Mountain Voice, that kept the scattered homesteaders informed about issues affecting their community. The children thrived in their new environment. Ruth, now 14, had grown into a confident young woman who helped teach the younger children in their mountain school. Jerry, at 10, showed remarkable aptitude for mathematics and science, and Andrew began preparing him for eventual university study. Matthew, now 8, had overcome his early shyness and become the family comedian, always ready with a joke or funny story to lighten the mood. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The woman who had arrived on the mountain, broken and ashamed, had been transformed into someone strong, confident, and purposeful. She had discovered reserves of courage and determination she had never known she possessed, and she had learned that family was not about blood relations, but about the bonds of love and commitment that people chose to forge with each other. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch of their new home, watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and pink, Andrew took her hand and smiled. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "The life we've built here, the challenges we've faced?" Sarah considered the question seriously, thinking back over the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Never," she said finally. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Even though we never had children of our own? Sarah looked at Ruth, who was reading to Matthew while Jerry worked on a mechanical puzzle Andrew had brought back from his latest trip. "We did have children of our own," she said softly. "They just came to us in a different way." Andrew squeezed her hand. "I love you, Sarah Rogers." The words, spoken with quiet sincerity, filled Sarah with warmth. Their love had grown slowly, built on respect and shared experience rather than passion, but it was no less real for its gentle nature. "I love you too," she replied. "All of you." As if summoned by her words, the children looked up from their activities and smiled. Ruth closed her book and came to sit beside them, followed by the boys. They sat together in comfortable silence, a family forged by choice rather than chance. Watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Tell us the story again," Matthew requested, settling against Sarah's side, "about how you and Papa found each other." Sarah smiled, remembering the scared, broken woman who had climbed into these mountains seeking nothing more than escape from her shame. "Once upon a time," she began, "there was a woman who thought she was worthless because she couldn't have children." "But she was wrong," Ruth interrupted, continuing the familiar tale. "Because she was meant to be our mother all along. And there was a man who lived alone on a mountain," Jerry added, "who needed a family just as much as we needed parents. And they found each other," Matthew finished, "and lived happily ever after." "Are we living happily ever after?" Ruth asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Sarah looked around at her family, at the home they had built together through struggle and determination, at the community they had helped create in this beautiful, harsh place. "Yes," she said with absolute certainty, "we are." The years that followed brought their own challenges and joys, but the Rogers family faced them together with the strength that had been forged in their earliest trials. Andrew's work as a federal land agent took him throughout the territory, and eventually to Washington, D.C., where he testified before Congress about the need for stronger protections for homesteaders. Sarah's newspaper, The Mountain Voice, grew from a local newsletter to a territorial publication that was read by settlers and politicians alike. Her clear, honest reporting and her willingness to take on powerful interests made her a respected voice for ordinary families throughout the region. Ruth grew into a remarkable young woman who combined her mother's intelligence with her own natural leadership abilities. She became the first student from their mountain school to attend university, studying journalism with the intention of continuing the family tradition of fighting for justice. Jerry's mathematical gifts led him to pursue engineering, and he eventually designed irrigation systems that helped other mountain families improve their farming operations. His practical intelligence and innovative thinking made him a valuable resource for the entire community. Matthew, the shy little boy who had once clung to Sarah's skirts, grew up to become a teacher like his adoptive father. He established schools throughout the territory, carrying on Andrew's commitment to education and ensuring that other children would have the opportunities that had been given to him. As Sarah entered her 50s, she often reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from despair to fulfillment. The woman who had once been cast aside as worthless had built a life of meaning and purpose, not despite her inability to bear biological children, but because of her willingness to love children who needed parents. The mountain cabin that had started as a refuge had become the heart of a thriving community. The Rogers homestead was a gathering place for neighbors, a school for local children, and a symbol of what could be accomplished when people refused to accept defeat. One autumn evening, as 3 generations of the Rogers family gathered for dinner, Sarah's granddaughter, Ruth's eldest child, asked the same question that had been posed years earlier. "Grandma Sarah, tell us about how you and Grandpa Andrew found each other." Sarah smiled, looking around the table at the faces of her family, biological grandchildren mixing freely with adopted ones, all of them part of the legacy she and Andrew had built together. "It's a story about second chances," she began, her voice carrying the wisdom of years and experience. about how sometimes the thing you think is your greatest failure can become your greatest blessing. She told a familiar tale, but with new details that came from the perspective of age and reflection. She spoke about the shame that had driven her from her first life, about the fear and uncertainty that had marked her early days on the mountain, about the gradual building of trust and love that had created their family. The most important thing, she concluded, looking directly at the children gathered around the table, is that family isn't about blood or biology. It's about choice and commitment and love. Your grandfather and I chose each other, and we chose all of you. And that choice has made our lives richer than we ever dared to dream. Andrew, now silver-haired but still strong, reached across the table to take her hand, and we'd make the same choice again, every single time. The simple statement carried the weight of decades of shared experience, of challenges faced together and overcome through mutual support and determination. It was a testament to the power of love to transform lives and create meaning from the most unlikely circumstances. As the evening wound down and the family dispersed to their various homes and activities, Sarah stepped out onto the porch that had been the site of so many important moments in their lives. The mountain air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the stars shone with the brilliant clarity that only came at high altitude. She thought about the woman she had been when she first climbed this mountain, broken and convinced that her life held no purpose. That woman could never have imagined the rich, full life that had grown from the seeds of her supposed failure. Andrew joined her on the porch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as they stood together looking out over the valley that had become their world. "Any regrets?" he asked, echoing the question he had posed years earlier. Sarah considered all the paths not taken, all the conventional choices she might have made if circumstances had been different. "Only one," she said finally. Andrew looked at her in surprise. "What's that?" Sarah smiled, thinking of all the children who had passed through their home over the years, all the lives they had touched and been touched by in return. "That we didn't start sooner." Andrew chuckled, understanding immediately what she meant. Their unconventional family had been such a source of joy and purpose that the only regret was not having more time to share that joy with even more children who needed homes. As they stood together on the porch, surrounded by the peace and beauty of the mountain night, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction that came from a life well lived. She had been given away for being childless, cast aside as worthless and defective. But in the end, she had found her true purpose, not in spite of that rejection, but because of it. She had become exactly who she was meant to be, a mother to children who needed her, a partner to a man who valued her strength, and a woman who had learned that worth was not measured by society's narrow standards, but by the love and commitment one brought to the world. The mountain wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the possibilities it might hold. Sarah Rogers smiled and prepared to embrace whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the family she was meant to have. In the end, that was more than enough. It was everything.